here. Welcome to this episode of Popular Cradle. I am joined today by Yara. Hello, Yara.
Hi, Ree. How's it going?
Good. We have missed you. I feel like the past few episodes we've had no Yara. So glad that Yara is back. And we have two other guests today joining us. We have Taher and Miriam from the Palestinian Youth Movement. Hi, Taher. Hi, Miriam. Thanks for joining.
Hey, Ree. How are you, Yara? Thanks for having us here.
Amazing. It's good to have you guys. Taher and Miriam are generously joining us today to talk about a course that they just wrapped up called America's Forever Wars in the Middle East. So today we're going to have a conversation about that course, which is about the imperialist war machine in the Middle East, not just the war on terror, but the deeper history of the US's subjugation, extraction, and de-development of the Middle East in the US's own interest. And so the course explains this phenomenon through these case studies, Egypt, Iraq, and of course, Palestine, and also gets into what it means for the Palestine movement to confront this war machine as it operates globally, not just in Gaza, of course, not just in the Middle East. So, Miriam, maybe I will start with you. Why teach a course right now about America's Forever Wars?
Thanks, Shannon. Thanks for having us here. That's a really good place to start. One of the things that we've been seeing across the U.S. is as a result of 2 years of genocide, as a result of seeing, regular people seeing the horrors that the U.S. is inflicting on the rest of the world. I think it's safe to say that there's a real kind of growing anti-war sentiment. And actually, one of the things that Trump technically ran on was ending the endless wars, ending the forever wars, right? So there's this mass kind of base of people who really support this idea of ending this concept of the U.S. going to war.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem that we've been seeing is that there's a group of forces who are taking advantage of this sentiment, and they're trying to kind of repackage U.S. world domination as something different than what it actually is. They're trying to repackage this idea of the forever wars as some sort of mistake that one group of the ruling class made at some point in time, a correctable error that, these far-right forces maybe can correct now. And of course, what we know is that that's a lie. And what's really missing from this anti-war sentiment is an understanding of U.S. imperialism itself, understanding what is actually behind this drive for war. Why is the U.S. constantly going to war? And why does it extend beyond just U.S. intervention in the Middle East, right?
Yeah, Miriam, and you touched on something that I think is really important around the last 2 years of genocide, right? Which is that ultimately, in the movement, we've been saying for the last 2 years that nothing's ever going to be the same, and that Gaza has changed the world, right?
Mm.
And I think these are more than just slogans. The reality is that so many people's lives have been completely transformed by what they've been seeing on their TV screens, on their telephone screens. And ultimately, I think so much of the movement and so much of public opinion, I think, has really shifted. And one of the things that we talked about in a previous episode is how we expect for Zionism and Zionist institutions to try to actually reframe the public shift, potentially even kind of distance themselves, right? Saying
Try
that
to recover their image, yeah.
Exactly, yeah, that this was Netanyahu's government, this isn't the character of Zionism, these kinds of things. And I think that this actually extends also to some of the popular anti-war, the ability of this movement to actually translate into a concrete anti-war movement right now is for us to be able to teach people and to make sure that people really understand what it is that allowed for this genocide to happen, right? The concrete role of U.S. imperialism, not as the anomaly of, the Trump administration, not as kind of a foreign policy mistake, right? Which is exactly what you're pointing to, but actually what are the tools that we need in order to actually show people who have already been moved and transformed over the last 2 years that this isn't a sort of stain in terms of U.S. history, but actually is a reflection of US imperialism.
Right, that it's not an aberration, but actually like the way this system operates. So, Tahir, if we're trying to give people, if you were trying to give people the tools with which to analyze the last 2 years, and in fact, to analyze the past few decades, let's say, of American foreign policy, like the class is called America's Forever Wars in the Middle East. What then do you want people to know about forever wars? What does forever wars mean? And how do America's forever wars like function then for the empire?
This is a great question, and thanks again, Reed, Yara, Miriam. It's good to be with all of you. I think what the course brings out really, really strongly, and it's been touched on already by others, is that the forever wars, in fact, the name suggests this, but it's not even an isolated instance or a particular battle, an attack on Libya, an attack on Palestine, an attack on Iran or Iraq, but rather an overall process which serves a particular goal. And I think what we bring out in this course is that ultimately it serves the goal of the ruling class of America and its allies in NATO and across the West, and globally speaking, in a number of different ways. Whether it's destroying states that pose some kind of opposition to the project that these people, the ruling elite and class, have, as was the case, and we may discuss later on, in Libya, whether it's destroying nations and countries in order to open up markets for construction companies and agricultural businesses and all kinds of different sections of the capitalist economy, or whether it's like sanctioning people into oblivion to force them to submit, that this is all one sort of process that serves conquering markets, conquering people for their access to workers, new opportunities for investment from the point of view of this small minority of people. And in fact, and I think that the course closed really strongly on, at the expense of the vast, vast majority of the world, including those people who reside in the United States and Canada and Britain, who often we might think of as like the beneficiaries of US imperialism. I think sometimes, and I see it in the movement, and I think it's one of the crucial interventions of the course, we may have this idea of like trickle down imperialism, On a side note, Yara knows I love to reference trickle down, but trickle down imperialism, where by the system, by the actions of the United States abroad and the amassing of more and more and more sources of wealth, ultimately American workers benefit, and similarly in other Western states. And I think what reality shows, and what these right-wingers are really latching onto, is that that is not the case. In fact, the vast majority of people are impoverished by this. So to summarize, I think what we really want people to understand is that this is a global process and system that repeats over and over again. It takes place in different countries and different flashpoints and battles, but it's not just an abstraction. It's real concrete people with stakes in very particular things, imposing their interests at the expense of the global majority.
Yeah, I heard somebody describe America's Forever Wars recently as we have to think of this as a process that is actually it's a massive wealth transfer from global working classes, including the American working class, to the ruling class in the US and the West, right? And I think that's such an important perspective or framework through which to see this.
That's exactly actually the point that we were trying to get to with this course, this point of it being a wealth transfer. And for those of you who took the course, for those of you who haven't yet, we're going to spoil it, but we actually start with, where does imperialism come from? And the answer, of course, is capitalism, right? And it develops as a system to allow for the expansion of capitalism around the globe at a certain historical point, a certain moment in time. So that framework of it's a wealth transfer, of the way that it exploits the working class all around the world was central to how we developed it. The other thing I wanted to add here, just with the term forever wars, I think a lot of people, when they think about the forever wars, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Probably the war on terror, right? For most people, it's associated with, the U.S. Invasion and occupation of Afghanistan and Iraq.
Yeah, this is the forever war of our lifetime, or
exactly.
Yeah,
exactly. And many, many people are living the repercussions of that, right? And I think there's become this consensus that, that was a mistake or whatever, which, again, to call the murder of over 1 million people a mistake is I think kind of gets to the heart of some of the callousness. But anyway, the point that I'm getting to is, I think there was two things we wanted to show is, first, the forever war concept isn't limited to the war on terror, right?
Right.
It's something that the US has used over and over again, starting in the Cold War and beyond, to kind of expand and consolidate its empire around the globe. And the second is kind of to break down this idea of forever too, because it doesn't have to be a permanent thing, and it hasn't always been a thing. It's been a thing that's tied historically to the development of imperialism. So we can actually trace over time how this started, where it started from, why it started, and we can understand that there's going to have to be something different moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the things that was really interesting about the course is the fact that you didn't start with the war on terror, right? Or the war of terror. It's actually
like
what we should
9/11
probably
is
call
not
it.
the starting point. Yeah.
Yeah. But then there's like actually this history around the Cold War and, Egypt that I think is really tied to questions of like de-development, national liberation, sovereignty. Can you all talk us through that? Like what the story is around the Cold War and Egypt and how this tells us a tale not only of like, war, but actually one of de-development and complicates how we understand sovereignty and national liberation.
Do you want to start? Do you want me to start? Whatever.
Well, I think as an Egyptian, you should start.
As an Egyptian. No, that's thanks for that question, Yara, because this is exactly the history that we trace in the first session. So the first session starts really with an explanation of the world scene after World War II. Before World War II, we had a lot of these major capitalist powers in Europe, and including the United States, kind of fighting amongst themselves for control over the rest of the globe, and actually end up fighting each other with devastating circumstances in the Second World War. Now, America, or the United States, kind of partially as a consequence of its geography, but also of the way it had developed its industry and its financial sector up to that time, comes out of the war in a much better position by far than the rest of Europe. Europe is basically in ruins. The US, on the other hand, has been the supply chain for the Allies during the course of the Second World War. They're kind of at the height of building their productive forces in the United States. They're at the height of development of weapons, etc. They have almost full employment. This is kind of unheard of. We can't even imagine today what it would look like to have less than 2% unemployment.
Yeah.
But their entire economy is geared towards supporting this war effort. It's a war economy, and it's allowed the US to become incredibly productive. And with the close of the war, they couldn't allow that to just stop. What would that mean for the US? It would mean the total kind of devastation of the way the economy had been built. And there's also, you can just imagine it, right? Like all of these people who are employed in these war-related sectors, what are they going to do now that this effort is winding down? There needs to be a way to redirect this to continue, because they're fighting, on the one hand, the threat of social crisis that is spreading in Europe, right? But also fighting to maintain their dominance in this new scene. And this is a huge opportunity and an opening to basically revive Europe, to use American industry and wealth to revive Europe, of course, to the US's benefit, and of course, to stop the spread of communism in Europe. But also, it's an opportunity to take over in all of these areas of the globe where Europe was previously dominant. So you think about the Middle East, who were the colonial powers that were dominant there before World War II? It's the British, it's the French. And now with their empires in decline, the US has this new opportunity as the world's primary kind of productive power, primary power just generally, to actually enter these markets and take over. And maybe Taher can talk a little bit more about this. There's a big hurdle to this. And this is where we start to see war, or not start to see, war's been playing a part this whole time, but increasingly wars all across the global south become a key component of US policy, because you start to have the threat of national liberation struggles and anti-colonial struggles all across the global south. So like I just said, the empires are in decline. a lot of these places that were colonized are now fighting for independence. And this is the scene that the US enters into and tries to control.
I mean, just to kind of build off of what Miriam has started us on, these colonies played, these nations that were colonized and dominated by whether it's France, Italy, Portugal, any number of European powers, their economies and their entire societies in many cases by colonialism were structured to serve whatever country they were dominated by. In many cases, that looks like monocrop economies where a huge country is dedicated, for example, to the production of sugar, as happened across the Caribbean, or to sort of start moving us towards Egypt, dedicated in large part towards the production of cotton, a single good that was
Right.
feeding this European economy.
Mhm.
And so as these countries start to become independent, many of them take a position of, wanting to build national development, wanting to build sovereignty, wanting to provide a better life for the hundreds of thousands to millions of people who have labored and toiled and suffered under the flag of some European power. And they enter this context in which the United States is angling for markets, is jockeying to dominate them, to extend all of the stuff that Miriam talked about, the auto factories that were built up so dramatically for the war effort, or the huge amounts of money that were amassed at that time, and it could then be invested. But also, many of these countries resist this. And then Egypt is a key example of that. So in the early 1950s, we have the free officers movement take power from the Egyptian monarchy, which had been largely brought into the British system and the French as well, and has a complicated history that I think maybe we can get into in future episodes, or listeners can study for themselves more deeply. But the free officers movement comes to power in the early 1950s in Egypt under the leadership of Jamal Abdel Nasser, with a mandate to build a national economy, to build a form of Egyptian sovereignty, but to take that beyond just the borders of Egypt and actually to lead a kind of broader pan-Arab movement for the sovereignty and liberation of all the Arab peoples. And Nasser, many listeners I'm sure are quite familiar, becomes this iconic figure, titan, in fact, in the eyes of many Arab people and Arab masses, as a symbol really of sovereign and national development. And becomes also even a global figure who allies with people like Kwame Nkrumah, Sukarno from Indonesia, and others who lead what's called the non-aligned movement,
Right.
which, as Miriam gestured to, along with communism and the sort of world system or system being built by the Soviet Union, is a major impediment towards the U.S. or U.S. imperialism extending its tentacles and its reach further into countries. Because what does it ultimately prioritize? It prioritizes development that is controlled by the people of the country that's producing the resources and doing the work. It prioritizes diplomatic relationships that are not completely subordinated to the U.S. In fact, it imagines the UN where, it's not the U.S. and a bunch of countries under its thumb voting in one position.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, Taher, you're talking about a really critical era in terms of the peak of anti-colonialist struggle, right? You've got a period where a counterforce is developing in terms of both at a material level and ideologically through the USSR, and then also through the Chinese Revolution. And so there's this kind of example that starts to form for much of the world around the possibility of an alternative path, not just of not one that just outright rejects development, but exactly like you were saying, is taking the question of development very seriously, but trying to produce forms of development that look quite different to capitalist development. And then, at this period, you've got the Bandung Conference taking place, and so much of the global South, including from revolutionary global South nations like Cuba to sort of more centrist kind of global South nations, to ones that are maybe both maybe ideologically or in some ways have some alignment to the US, but also are questioning the ways in which they benefit or don't benefit from their relationship to the US.
Yes.
So you've got this really fascinating kind of development of not only the conversations around multipolarity, but also what do South-South diplomatic relationships, or what can South-South diplomatic relationships look like? And it's during this period that the US also is assessing and monitoring and realizing that it needs a much more I guess, aggressive intervention in the global south to essentially stop the possibility of any kind of revolutionary alternative or South South collaboration.
That's an excellent point. And I think I really want to emphasize what you raised about the breadth, kind of politically, of the non-aligned movement, of this global south or third world, basically like, you know, uprising or counter thrust to the system that the United States is aiming to build, which subordinates all of these people. And Egypt is a key example of that, because even under Nasser, you know, it's a different system than a revolutionary state like Cuba or Vietnam or China, which is more aligned and placed in the communist and socialist tradition. And
Right.
actually, the Egyptians were willing to kind of try to play off both of these countervailing poles off of each other in order to advance the interests of their people and to advance the cause of pan-Arabism more generally, with all of the contradictions and difficulties that would occur for that in practice. And so for those who have seen the course, they'll probably remember this. And for those who haven't, I think you can consider this to be a small advertisement, in fact. And I encourage you to go deeper and register. You can still do that and get all these facts really like presented to you in a clear platform. But, you know, the Egyptians were willing to take loans at some point from the United States. They had diplomatic channels with the United States. And what we see through that history is that the United States loans were, as we see today, filled with conditions, you know, payments required by a certain time, if missed, high interest rates. A condition of lending is stakeholding rights for a U.S. company. A condition of development is that, you know, U.S. interests politically and economically are advanced. And this clearly isn't the project that Egypt is trying to build, as it's also in building out its own national auto industry, for example, that could in fact rival something like what the United States, or it would be hoped could rival something like what the United States has. Production of televisions, production of kind of infrastructure and things that aren't totally dominated by the US.
Mm-hmm.
And to take us back to de-development, this is like obviously inflames the United States, and we can see different American politicians speaking in quite clear terms about the evils of Egypt not paying back or paying loans with really, really high interest rates. And it also, I think, brings in the question of Israel and sort of tracing us back to America's forever wars in the Middle East and how do they relate to Israel? Well, Israel, we often hear this in the movement, it's a primary kind of forward base for the United States and US imperialism. And it's really a tool of de-development, in fact. And that story plays out all the way throughout history, you know, up until today. I think when we've seen all of the wars that Israel has waged over the last 2.5 years, they've destroyed hospitals, they've destroyed electrical plants. In Gaza specifically, they've destroyed all forms of infrastructure. But in other countries around the region as well, like Yemen, where they consistently bomb electrical plants in Al-Hudaydah. And in Egypt specifically in the 1970s, you know, all through this period kind of after 1967, they're going with American planes and they're bombing closer and closer to Cairo, striking the infrastructure. And I think this speaks to both the development and what it is meant to do to Israel's role within that. And it kind of sets the stage for how severe the changes in the broader pan-Arab movement.
So exactly, Israel as this forward operating base, as is often thought of for the US as a tool of de-development, is doing this through war. And one of the kind of primary things we talked about introducing the concept of imperialism is the way imperialism actually operates around the world. How does it subdue different countries that are fighting for their own independence and their own development? And we talked about two kind of key ways. The first is through military means, and the second is through economic means. So you can think in the region in the Middle East, Israel, since 1967, has for the US played that role of using war, of using militarism as this way to destabilize countries all around the region. In Egypt, what that looked like after 1967, and as Taher was kind of gesturing to, was destruction of key infrastructure and also a lot of cost, right? Like just this constant state of war that makes continuing the project of development more and more difficult. And part of the kind of goal of this, or the strategy of this, is to try to disunify the different united parts of the Arab struggle, right? It would be a lot easier if you can break off different countries and have them kind of negotiate independently rather than being part of this unified Arab bloc that can wage a broader struggle against Israel, with the Palestinian liberation movement at the heart of it, right?
Right.
So war is one way to do this, to kind of break down your adversary. And then the other thing that happens is once a country is in this position, in this more difficult position, of course, there's a lot of complexities of history in the middle. But in the case of Egypt, what we see is a new administration, a new Egyptian government that is willing to play by the rules of the United States. And this is where the economic tool of imperialism, the economic leg of imperialism, starts to play a big role.
This is Sadat's government, right, Miriam?
Yes, exactly. Anwar Sadat, he becomes the president of Egypt. And this is the path that Egypt then starts going down during the 70s. And one of the tools that US imperialism uses are these incredibly predatory loans, right? You can imagine the kind of position that developing countries are in, right? It's very difficult to kind of have the resources that you need. And the US uses these global financial institutions that it itself built after World War II. It built to put the US in a dominant position in the global economy. So institutions like the World Bank, like the International Monetary Fund, which were both designed to kind of give out loans that would essentially de-develop countries, right?
Right.
Like take the World Bank, for instance. The World Bank gives out loans for what are called capital projects. So projects that are related to development and are large scale, things like dams or like agriculture. And the point of World Bank loans really is to control what countries produce. It's to say, actually, you shouldn't have diversified agriculture that can meet the needs of your people. You should grow one crop that can be exported to the United States, right?
Right.
It's to put them in a position of dependence vis-a-vis their agricultural production.
Yeah, just to jump in here for a second, Miriam, taking a step back, like changing, restructuring, imposing changes on an economy like this, imposing this kind of massive change in the agriculture of a country, of a nation, it really changes everything. It changes people's connection to the land. It changes the way people are growing food, the way a society sustains itself. And it's actually making me think of a story one time that you told me about when you were growing up in Egypt.
It's honestly a tangent. It's like nothing in comparison, but it has to do with this agriculture thing. Like it's like what imperialism does also, like what capitalism does is like destroy like so many like layers of what it means to be like a human being with your own like culture and like produce and whatever. And like, I remember like growing up in Egypt, strawberries, for example, they would come once a year. Once a year, you get really excited for strawberries. And they're these like tiny morsels that are so sweet and fragrant and delicious. And at a certain point after I moved, I came back and I found you can get strawberries year round in the grocery store, and they're all Driscoll strawberries, right? It's like, and what that does is it actually destroyed the original crop. Like those seeds barely exist anymore for mass cultivation. Like seed saving is like a big kind of sovereignty project because it's like saving the richness of human existence, basically.
Right. And people's connection to the land, a society's connection to the land. I actually think that's really powerful, Miriam. And I think we're not just talking like high up ideas or abstracted thoughts, but we have to ground it in the impact of what de-development does to nations. We're talking about forever wars, but we also need to talk about how destructive it is. And so you're talking about what is happening in Egypt. At what point does this dynamic between the United States and Egypt like really start to ramp up?
In 1977, Egypt takes out its first loan from the International Monetary Fund. And the loans come with this set of conditions. And Taher gestured to this a little bit earlier. But a lot of the conditions involve removing protections from your industry. So tariffs, for example, if you had a tariff in place, what does a tariff do? It makes it so that there's taxes on imported goods. It makes imported goods more expensive, right? The goal of that is to allow your local industry to develop, allow your local industry to sell products cheaper than what the imported products are being sold for, right? If you remove those tariffs, now the mass-produced goods from the United States, consumer goods, for example, are going to be a lot cheaper. The US has benefited from decades longer of developing their productive industries, right, compared to a country like Egypt. Now, for example, American cars are a lot cheaper to produce and to buy than an Egyptian produced car. And what it does is it takes the legs out of local industry and it replaces it with foreign investment, foreign capital, and dependence on getting these goods from elsewhere. So it puts these countries in a position where they have to constantly be kind of in a position of dependence.
Yeah, like what the United States is doing in Egypt, what you're describing, Miriam, is like preventing Egypt from developing. And if a country can't develop economically, and if a country is constantly being riddled with military and security concerns, right? What you're actually chipping away at, what the United States is chipping away at in Egypt in the 60s, 70s, is Egypt's sovereignty. So we've talked about this like military leg of imperialism, the economic leg of imperialism, and how these are exemplified in the Egypt example. But Taher, you've talked as well about a political leg of imperialism. How is that playing out in Egypt?
Well, I think it actually gets back to something that Miriam raised when she was talking about what is at the very beginning of what is the United States strategy in the period, coming out of World War II with respect to Arab nationalism and pan-Arabism, which is to divide different theaters of struggle and to prevent basically negotiations and struggle from happening on a large landmass with a large number of people and to break people down into nation states. And so it's waging this kind of political and diplomatic war, it being the United States and Israel against Egypt. It's accusing Egypt every time it leans to the Soviet Union to get a loan, which it needs because the United States conditions are ridiculous, of being like a Soviet agent. It's allowing and arming and pushing Israel to bomb deeper and deeper and deeper into Egyptian territory, closer and closer to Cairo, not only to kill people and to destroy infrastructure, but also to completely undermine Gamal Abdel Nasser and to paint this picture for the world, which is like, this guy is putting forth a project which represents the interests of the Arab people and the Arab masses. And right here in his own country, people are living under a threat of bombs. And we see echoes of that today, for example, I think with the United States and Israel's move vis-a-vis Iran, vis-a-vis Lebanon. And so ultimately what this is meant to do, these three legs, is to work together not only to de-develop the economy to a point where, like Egypt, for example, which can produce huge quantities of wheat, even until today, relies so heavily on Ukrainian wheat that it went through a bread crisis at the beginning of the war, that there's no sort of indigenous defense industry that's capable of mounting a threat to Israel. You have a country like we see today in Egypt that's the second largest recipient of U.S. military aid.
And a massive, I think the third, maybe largest recipient of IMF funds.
Exactly. And any kind of political project that is based in sovereignty, and just really clearly what that means is like the rights of the Egyptian people to decide their own political future, to build their own economic destinies, and to participate in a broader struggle for liberation, to support the Palestinian struggle, is closed. And so you're always asking, how do I not get bombed and eat, and not how can I build this better future?
Exactly. And what do you have as a result today? Egypt is basically a client state of the United States in the Middle East, right? Now, we also have another example, a big one on the minds of everybody right now in terms of another example of America's forever wars in the Middle East is, of course, the invasion of Iraq, right? And maybe bringing us to the war on terror. Something you referenced, Tahir, was how the United States was covering up all of this real, like, material economic function of imperialism, the de-development of Egypt. They covered it up with, ideological attacks on Nasser in Egypt, attacking the figure of Nasser himself, right? This kind of like evil or crazy Arab leader, this kind of thing. And we see a real ideological propaganda project, obviously, in the war on terror to justify what is also the attempt at de-developing Iraq, right? So maybe take us through, Miriam, if you could start us off with like, is the war on terror about de-development also in the same way that the United States de-developed Egypt into a client state?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, this is the theme that we trace throughout this course. One of the big differences, of course, with what happens in Iraq compared to what happens in Egypt is by the time we get to the 90s, we're dealing with a totally different world, right? And the kind of elephant in the room here is that there's the fall of the Soviet Union. We're entering what is a unipolar world order. So a world order where the United States is the sole superpower. And the US strategy at this point, the US, empire strategy is basically to make sure it can contain its grip all around the world and to prevent the rise of any other major power.
Right.
I think you can still think about this strategy today, right, with China. But going back to the 90s, Iraq presented a major obstacle to this. So Iraq was another country where, of course, very complicated political history, but ultimately what you have is a strong state that had nationalized its oil resources and funneled that into development for the Iraqi people. You had some of the best schools and education systems in the entire region, hospitals, etc. Everything that oil wealth could bring to a people. And again, there's a lot of years that I don't want to kind of just compress into one, but there is a threat to the US and Israel with Iraq kind of continuing to amass military and political power.
Yes.
And continuing to strengthen its sovereignty, right? The US and Israel at this time are concerned with the threat of Iran. Of course, the Iranian Revolution had happened. They're concerned with Iraq. They're concerned with Syria. And the strategy that's kind of devised is referred to as this clean break theory. It's this theory that basically you can actually directly invade and destroy a country to completely destabilize it and use that to have a domino effect on countries all across the region.
And note also the United States' narrative around the domino effect that they're trying to prevent, the domino effect of communism spreading, right? Like if one country falls to some supposed despotic leader in the Middle East, then everything else will fall, right? But they are also enacting a domino effect.
Right. And they're enacting an incredibly violent domino effect. So by the time you get to the 90s, there's this consensus that there needs to be regime change in Iraq. You need to get rid of Saddam Hussein. Saddam is a massive barrier to US interests in the region. Of course, Iraq is an oil-rich country. Control over resources is a really important part of this story in the sense of oil is the driver of the global economy in many ways, and whoever controls those resources is in a much better position globally, right? But that's only part of the story, because the other part of the story is maintaining, again, this kind of global dominance that the US is so interested in accomplishing now that there's no other superpower to kind of stand in its way. So what ends up happening in Iraq, and we trace this through the third session, which is really a case study of this, is what's the posture of US imperialism towards the region in the unipolar order? That's kind of the question that we're looking at. And again, we're responding to some of these claims that the Iraq war was just a mistake. It was a few like rich, greedy people who wanted it to their own benefit, right? But what that misses is that that's actually the system of capitalism. That's how capitalism works. That's how imperialism works. It is just to the benefit of this tiny minority who rule over the global majority to, again, like we said at the beginning, transfer that wealth to their own pockets. So in Iraq, one of the things we trace is through the first Gulf War, through the US bombardment and kind of devastation of Iraq, all the way to the actual invasion and occupation of Iraq after 2003. And a big part of this story, Rhiannon, like you mentioned, is ideological. They have to convince the American population that Saddam Hussein is a threat, right? They invent the weapons of mass destruction narrative. I think everyone is very familiar with this at this point, especially in relation to the role the mass media has played in the genocide in Gaza, with just, genocide denial, or kind of trying to paint all of Gaza as a population that's deserving of death, right? That's a very similar story as to what happens with Iraq. So they use this boogeyman to enable the invasion, occupation, to try to win support for the invasion, occupation. Of course, there was a very strong anti-war movement as well at the time. But ultimately, one of the important things that we look at in this session is that there's, in terms of the relationship to the capitalist system, right? Because this is one of the running themes, is what this is about is opening more markets, getting access to more resources, finding more cheaper labor, extending global domination to extend the wealth and power of a tiny minority, right?
The transfer of wealth, yeah.
Exactly. So one of the things we look at is there's all of the industries that kind of benefit during the war, right? And they're wrapped up in key part of the ruling class in the US government. There's the actual weapons manufacturers, etc. But there's also a whole host of industries that benefit after the war. And we look at this from two perspectives. There's the ones that directly go in and benefit. Construction companies, for example, agricultural companies like Monsanto, right, sells seeds to Iraq. And then there's also, you can think about it from the perspective of the whole global economy, the whole functioning of the global economy. You can kind of imagine for capitalism, right, it needs everything to run without barriers, without any barriers to the domination of the capitalist system. And removing those barriers is what imperialism does. And it does so by force, or it does so by economic coercion, or, kind of diplomatic maneuvering. Whatever it takes, it needs to distort the functioning of countries all around the world and mold the political systems of these countries into a model that will work for the smooth functioning of US-led capitalism and imperialism. That's really the story of Iraq.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Iraq war is so important for multiple reasons. Like, on the one hand, it shows so clearly this sort of wealth transfer, right? What de-development looks like concretely. I mean, you're talking about the massacre of over 1 million Iraqis. You're talking about the essentially theft of so many industries, right? Like all of these industries that were state-owned industries, from electric industries to phone industries to, all of these major industries are now in the hands of, multinational or transnational corporations, most of which are American corporations. And if I'm not mistaken, I think the Iraqi charter or constitution actually had to be rewritten post-US invasion in order to allow for overseas companies to actually move their holdings, right, their ownership of Iraqi assets to the United States. And so you've got this really jarring example of what imperialism and America's forever wars looks like and who benefits. And then you also have such a clear example of a mass movement of regular people that go out into the streets and build one of the most critical anti-war movements of the last few decades, which is the movement against the war in Iraq. And so it's such a critical example in that way. And, I'll never forget, like, because I'm a poli-sci student, so I've unfortunately had to endure a lot of like classes that offered different perspectives on American wars, and, how much political science literature really tries to reduce the war on Iraq to kind of like George Bush and debates within the Republican Party and this current versus that current. And that's not to say that these kinds of these kinds of pockets, like understanding the contradictions that exist within empire, is not important. Of course it is. But at the same time, ultimately, what we're talking about here is a system where corporations and a small minority are able to really benefit from war. And I think this leads us naturally to ask the question of the current genocide that we've been watching over the last 2 years, and not just watching, but struggling against as people who are involved in the movement. And one of the slogans of the last 2 years has been calling for an arms embargo. So we obviously know that weapons manufacturers are benefiting significantly, or logistics companies like Maersk are benefiting from Israel's genocide. And amidst all of this slaughter that we're seeing, the massacre of over 160,000 people in Gaza, immense profits are being accumulated by Israeli corporations, American corporations, European, and so on, as people across the world kind of mobilize into this mass movement. And I wonder, like, instead of just thinking about the weapons manufacturers and the logistics companies, and whether we can even kind of pose this question of, with the Trump deal and so on, like what is it concretely? Like, what are the lessons that we can extract from looking at the history of American imperialism to see what is the American ruling class trying to extract from in terms of profits from its genocide in Gaza?
Well, you've really laid out well what are some of the lessons of the Iraq War and what are some of the key clarifying insights we gained from studying it. And just to kind of reiterate, because I think it's such an important point, it's this totalizing drive towards profit that touches, and I want to say infects, every single level and every single sector of the American economy, of the world economy, of the system of imperialism. And as we record this podcast, we are meeting after 2+ years of genocide and 160,000 martyrs. And we're also meeting in a moment where the political future of Gaza is being discussed. What will rebuilding look like? What will political organization over Gaza look like in the coming period? What is phase 2 of the ceasefire negotiations going to mean? It's really about this. And as we're seeing this, as the Trump administration is pushing forth this board of peace vision, we not only see lessons of Iraq reemerge or similar patterns, we see some of the exact same people.
Yeah.
And so after the Americans destroyed Iraq through this brutal, horrific shock and awe campaign, they imposed a colonial government on the Iraqi people, headed by a guy called L. Paul Bremer, who became like the viceroy of Iraq, the unilateral ruler, who made all of these horrible decisions about stripping all forms of Iraqi sovereignty and selling off Iraqi industries, and worked with people like Tony Blair. And Tony Blair is, as we all know, he seems to be out now, but he was put forward as the top guy to be the lead of Trump's board of peace, right underneath Donald Trump, which is a glaring irony considering how much Donald Trump has campaigned on the Iraq war being a mistake or being some sort of crucial thing that he aims to fix. But it also shows you something about what the board of peace is going to mean in practice. And it doesn't just stop there. I think for me, at a personal level, one of the most memorable points in the course was that the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, that so many of us struggled against as it more or less led and administrated, along with the US as a state and Israel, a coordinated starvation campaign, the sadism of which I don't think we've seen something like it in at least in my lifetime. This Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, well, its personnel too, it has its roots in the Iraq war. And Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff and all of these Qatari and Gulf and Saudi interests that are tied up in various firms and equity management groups and stuff like that, as they talk about rebuilding, well, what Iraq shows us is that they're talking about a real estate bonanza that won't serve the Palestinian people. That in fact, I think they'd like to envision a potential cog in the displacement of the Palestinian people for securing not only massive profits for the global ruling class, but also further entrenched Israeli control of the land. You know, when Trump talks about the world's people coming to live in the Riviera that he wants to build in the Gaza Strip, well, it's clear that this rebuilding plan is something that will serve the overall ruling class and definitely will not serve Palestinian people in Gaza.
Exactly, Taher. So there are all these links, direct links actually, to the US's war of terror on Iraq. But there's also things that harken back to just straight up British colonialism in the region.
Yeah.
Like if you kind of look at the plan of the Board of Peace, it's really to turn Gaza into this colony of the United States, like a area that is actually directly controlled by the US, where everything that happens in there, all of this real estate development that you're talking about, Taher, is being actually used for the benefit of the American ruling class and is being used to displace the Palestinian people. But there's a broader perspective of why that's significant to the Trump administration, and not just that administration, but in general to American global interests. One of the big threats that a lot of administrations have been talking about, basically since Obama, is this threat of China. A lot of the American ruling class see China as this rising power that is actually going to be able to rival and compete with the US around the world. And they've been able to offer a lot to developing markets, right, across the region and across the world. So part of the plan for Gaza, to turn Gaza into a US colony, is to actually, very similar to how we think about the British, is to take that region of the world and turn it into this key link between three different continents, right? Between Africa and Europe and Asia. And of course, to accomplish that, it's not just the genocide in Gaza, but also we have to remember Israel has been waging a war on Lebanon, on Syria, on Iran, on all of these other countries that could pose a threat to the creation of this kind of US-led and run, basically, supply chain that could rival and de-link from China. So this is really the kind of geostrategic interest of the US in the region right now, or at least that the way that they're talking about it in their national security strategy. It's to create this alternative supply chain that the US is in control of, that Israel is literally policing for them, that allows them to basically integrate the Gulf region, all of the oil in that region, with all of the markets in Africa, in Europe, and to create this pipeline that is really for US use and is going to be used to basically block China from accessing that. So there's this broader role, and that plays in the interests of the entire American ruling class, not just the people that are directly profiting from this colonial plan for Gaza.
Right. I think what we're teasing out, if there's a theme here, it's that over and over and over again, the United States does the same thing. The United States destroys nations in the Middle East, in Egypt, in Iraq, in Palestine, de-develops those nations, destroys sovereignty. Why? So that it can maintain and spread American unipolarity.
Right. The United States is waging forever wars, this endless process of conquering people's markets, resources that we've talked about. And it's not actually something that's confined just to our region, to Palestine or the broader Arab and Middle East region. But even today, as we meet, we're seeing Trump and his cronies in office, and most of the ruling class, salivating and licking their lips and beating the drums of war against Venezuela. We, I think, as the Palestine movement, as people of conscience generally, for the last 2 years have had hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions on the streets. It's been a big theme of, I think, this podcast and just organizing in general, to note how many people's minds have changed, how radically consciousness has shifted. And what that has looked like is a really organized movement with infrastructure that's capable of carrying a political message, which is against genocide, which is against Zionism, which is against U.S. imperialism, which is against the perpetual drive for slaughter and war. And I think we need to keep that going right now. And we have a big responsibility to do that as Palestinians in general. And one element of that responsibility, just to bring us back to kind of what brought us here today, this course, is to offer a clear-eyed political analysis, because Miriam said it at the top of this, and we've said it many times to each other in private conversations, but a really alarming, I think, element of this current moment is that the people who have seeped in to kind of assume this role, to give direction about what is going on and what we do about this state of affairs, this economy that's powered by war, is the right, who I think by now we'll have seen as giving half measures, giving kind of deliberately confusing or confused diagnosis of the problem, which ultimately exonerates the ruling class, even if in certain cases it blames on particular industries like war or particular crucial vehicles through which the ruling class moves its program, like the Zionist lobby. And this is not to undermine how important the Zionist lobby is to Zionism and to U.S. imperialism in general, and to perpetuating or propping up this system, but it doesn't show the whole picture. And so ultimately the consequence of that is that it becomes easy for many to just sort of want to turn inwards. And that's what the right is capitalizing on. And we can't allow that. I think we need to continue to assert a politics of internationalism and to continue building on what we've seen, because it's going to matter most immediately for the people of Gaza and Palestine and the broader region. But ultimately, this is a fight for the whole.
I think that is a great place to end. Miriam, Taher, thank you so much for your time. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much for having us.
And just so all listeners know, you can still register for the course, America's Forever Wars in the Middle East. You can register at peoplesforum.org/foreverwars. When you register, you get access to all 4 recordings, the reading material, everything you need as if you were there for the course itself. Again, that's peoplesforum.org/foreverwars. We will see you on the next episode. Popular Cradle is made in partnership with the Palestinian Youth Movement. Thank you to the many people who contributed to the making of this episode. Our editor is Soraya Shockley. Our artwork is by Shenbi G and Vivek Venkatraman. Our theme music is composed by Salma Talib and performed by Clarissa Bitar and Hisham Jarmakani. Follow, like, and subscribe to us on social media at Popular Cradle. That's YouTube, Twitter, and Instagram at Popular Cradle.